6 emperors in 1 year. Rebellion in Carthage. Conspiracies in Rome. The siege of Aquileia. And blood on the marble slabs of the Senate. 2038 was the worst year in Rome's history. What happened in those 12 months that the empire almost collapsed? Why did the rulers fall one after another, like pieces in a cursed game? And most importantly, what does history itself tell us about this time? We plunge into a year when even the gods turn their backs on Rome. Everything began quietly. The 2037th year of our era was coming to an end without much upheaval. On the throne was Maximinus the Thracian, a man of the people, rough but resolute. He was respected by the soldiers but hated by the nobles. He rarely visited the capital, preferring the camps and forts of the German front. But Rome itself, despite its anxious shadow in the provinces, lived a familiar life. Intrigue, Senate debates, boring festivities. The empire existed as if by inertia, huge, slow, powerful. However, clouds were already gathering over this apparent stability. The gap between the capital and the army was becoming dangerously deep. The emperor was perceived as an outsider, a crude barbarian, a usurper. He was not welcome in the Senate, feared in the Curia. Even ordinary citizens whispered, was the price for order too high? On the outskirts of the empire, life was different. Provinces were paying more and more taxes, soldiers were rioting more often, and the local elites were feeling less and less dependent on the city. The mechanism that had held the empire in balance for centuries was beginning to shake like an old bridge under the weight of time. And so, in this tense expectation, on the verge of exploding, came the 2038th year. No soothsayer would predict that it would become a year of blood, betrayals, and political earthquakes. That 6 emperors will pass through the throne in just a few months. That the city king, Rome, would face an internal vortex of chaos like it had not known since the days of Gaius Caligula. And that this year will leave a mark, even in generations to come, as a warning. Even giants can fall. And they fall terribly. The story of Maximinus of Thrace is an ancient myth in reverse. Not a noble young man rising to the heights of power, but a barbarian from the dirt who took power and held it with an iron hand. His real name is lost. His origins are questionable. Perhaps a Thracian, perhaps a peasant from Lower Moesia. He was a giant, over 2 meters tall, with the physique of a gladiator. It was said that he bent horseshoes and ate more than 3 people at a time. Is that true? I don't think so, but the myth worked and inspired fear. He began his service as a common soldier. He rose step by step, centurion, tribune, legion commander. When Emperor Severus Alexander lost the support of his troops because of his softness and over-reliance on the Senate, the army revolted. In the spring of the 2035th year, on the banks of the Rhine, the legions proclaimed Maximus as the new emperor. Severus was killed by his own soldiers, and the road to power was paved with blood. The Senate was horrified. Such a man on the throne? A barbarian, ignorant of Greek philosophy, unreading Homer, speaking broken Latin? Against all tradition, against Decus and Mos Maiorum, he became emperor. Imperator Caesar Maximinus Augustus. And yet the Senate obeyed, formally. Maximin did not enter Rome. He stayed on the frontier, campaigning against the Germans. It was a strategy. Rely on the army, ignore the capital. But any stability was only an illusion. Military successes were mediocre, and the treasury was rapidly emptying. To finance the army, he taxed the already depleted provinces. Africa, the rich and proud land that fed Rome's bread and butter, suffered particularly. But worst of all was the atmosphere of suspicion. Maximus saw conspiracies everywhere. He executed senators, arrested officials, even provincial governors lived in fear. The fragile stability that had been held in place by the bonds of tradition and legal order was disappearing from the empire. People began to whisper, "Wouldn't it be better to die than to live under constant fear?" Thus rose the star of the soldier on the throne. But the higher he rose, the more enemies gathered in the shadows, and the first to dare an open challenge would find themselves far from Rome, in the sultry, dusty, proud province where rebellion would be born. Africa has always been special. More than 4 centuries had passed since Rome destroyed Carthage, but the spirit of independence and pride had never disappeared. It was the province of rich landowners, an elite, educated, and self-confident. It fed Italy with grain, olive oil, and taxes. And when the empire began to press harder and harder, it was here that the first conflagration began. At the beginning of the year 238, Carthage experienced what history would later call a spontaneous uprising. The people, angered by the greed of the imperial procurator, Maximian the Thracian, revolted. The procurator was assassinated. This was a direct challenge to Rome, and to legitimize the action, the rebels turned to the elderly proconsul of the province, Marcus Antonius Gordianus. Gordianus is a classic example of a Roman aristocrat of the old school. Noble, respected, educated, thoughtful. He was in his 80s and had no lust for power. But Carthage demanded a leader, and he agreed, not out of ambition, but out of duty. With him, his son, Gordian II, young, hot, less mature, but more determined, was proclaimed emperor. Thus began their short ruling dynasty, the Gordians. The Senate in Rome, learning of the revolt, saw it as an opportunity. They hated Maximus, considered him a usurper and a tyrant. And when the news of the proclamation of the Gordians came, the Senate, for the first time in a long time, decided to openly rebel against the incumbent emperor. The Gordians were recognized as legitimate rulers, Maximus as an enemy of the state. But the empire is not just the Senate and Carthage. In Numidia, a neighboring province, the governor Capelinus, a personal enemy of Gordiban II, loyal to Maximus, he marched against the rebels. At the Battle of Carthage, Gordian II died leading a poorly trained militia. Upon hearing of his son's death, Gordian I took his own life. Their reign lasted only 22 days. Carthage stood still again, covered in mourning and fear. But the chain reaction had already begun. The Senate could not back down. They went all in. The Gordians became a symbol not only of protest, but of an attempt to restore the republican spirit broken by military dictators. Though their fate was tragic, it signaled that Maximin no longer ruled alone. The empire was entering a civil war. No one could have known that this was only the beginning. Bloody confrontations, sieges, rebellions, executions, and new emperors, like cards being burned one by one. But at that moment, Rome still believed they could take control of the situation, and they were already choosing the next saviors, Pupienus and Balbinus. Gordian's death shook Rome. The Senate, siding with the rebels, was in a vulnerable position. They could not retreat. In the eyes of Maximinus Thrax, they were traitors, and all that remained was to look for new figures to continue the struggle. The choice was two: Pupienus and Balbinus. The decision was a compromise, almost desperate. Pupienus, an elderly military man, stern, experienced, but not loved by the commoners. Balbinus, polymath, orator, former consul, more philosopher than strategist. Together, they were to balance each other, sword and reason, army and culture. The Senate had hoped to find stability in their tandem, but the city met them with grim silence. Ordinary Romans, accustomed to the determination of emperors, did not accept the new rulers. Pupienus was feared. Balbinus despised. The crowd demanded someone who was their own. And in this noisy agony, an idea was born. Young Gordian III, the grandson of the late elder Gordian, a boy of only 13 years old, was appointed co-ruler. His appearance was a pure symbol, an act of reconciliation. He became the flag behind which the community was to rally. Meanwhile, Maximinus Thrax was on the move. When he heard what was happening, he gathered his troops and marched out of Pannonia. The goal was Rome. But his march was not a solemn march, but a slow nightmare. The spring of 238 was cold, and the army suffered from hunger and disease as it crossed the Alps. As Maximin approached Aquileia, a northern Italian city, he encountered a closed gate. The city, loyal to the Senate, refused to surrender. A siege began. In Rome, however, there was a different kind of struggle. The Senate frantically sought support from the provinces, collected money, handed out promises. Pupienus tried to organize the defense, Balbinus to keep order in the capital. But conflicts were already erupting between them. Distrust, different management styles, struggle for authority. With both hands, they clung to the boy Gordian as an amulet against the people's rage. Rome was becoming a powder keg. The praetorians, an elite guard tired of political intrigue, were beginning to whisper. They remembered how quickly power could be changed by force. To them, Pupienus and Balbinus were nothing, alien, arrogant, unable to command an army. The air reeked of betrayal. And yet the Senate continued to resist. It was as if the empire was splitting into two halves. One, rough, straight, armed, was moving from the north. The other, fragile, refined, Roman, was desperately trying to save itself, clinging to the remnants of republican dignity. No one knew that at Aquileia, the fate of the empire would take its next turn, a sharp and deadly one. While Maximus is besieging the city, a conspiracy is brewing in his own camp. Because even in the army, patience has limits. Aquileia is a city ancient but strong. In northeastern Italy, at the foot of the Alps, it has held off barbarian raids since the Republic. In 1928, it found itself in the path of Maximinus Thrax's army. The city closed its gates. The garrison was not large, but the locals stood with the soldiers, fortified the walls, and stocked up on food. They knew to surrender was to doom themselves to reprisals. Maximilian marched with rage, but met with determination. The siege dragged on. It was a rainy spring. The marshes around Aquileia were becoming traps. Provisions for the besiegers were becoming scarce. Disease, especially dysentery, was decimating the ranks. Discipline was falling. The soldiers, exhausted by cold and hunger, began to murmur. They saw the townsfolk hurling taunts, and even the charred remains of dead besiegers from the fortress walls, an act of psychological warfare that could break the spirit. Maximin was furious. He didn't understand why a simple city dared to stand up to the emperor. He ordered assault after assault, but to no avail. Each day brought more dead. His authority, honed on fear and strength, began to crack. The soldiers did not understand why they should die in this desolate place, for a ruler hated by all. And then, in late April, the inevitable happened. In the silence of the camp, among the tents, a group of officers made a decision. They entered the tent of Maximilian and his son, Maximilian the Younger, and killed them without resistance. The bodies were put on display for the army to see. It was over. The whole campaign was over in one morning, without a fight. The heads of Maximus and his son were cut off and sent to Rome. It was a victory for the Senate, but a hard and disturbing one. They welcomed the news with enthusiasm, but they knew that all bets were now off. There was no longer an enemy outside. Now the focus would return to the capital, to them. And there, in the heart of the empire, the internal cracks were already beginning to show. Maximian of Thrace was the first soldier on the throne in history. His reign proved that an army can elevate a man to power, but it cannot always keep him there. His death at Aquileia was a sign. Nothing lasts forever, neither fear nor power. And the empire, instead of stabilizing, went deep into chaos. Because the struggle for power was not over, it was only changing the scenery. The fall of Maximian Thrace brought a brief sigh of relief to the Senate, but also new problems. Victory was a Pyrrhic victory. The external threat was gone, but the internal threat was exposed. Pupienus and Balbinus, who had become formal rulers, could not agree. Their alliance was artificial, strained, almost hostile. Pupienus saw himself as the only one capable of controlling the army and the crisis. Balbinus, a staunch senator, saw him as a dangerous praetorian. They argued over every issue: taxes, amnesties, command. The empire, exhausted by civil war, craved order, but received only discord. Even in public, their cooled relationship was visible. Two old men who could not share the throne. Meanwhile, the Praetorian Guard watched, and angry. Their influence was waning. The Senate felt important again, appointing, removing, dictating terms. The Praetorians, those who had deposed and elevated emperors in the past, now felt superfluous and humiliated. Pupian wanted to reform the Guard, reduce its powers. Balbin hesitated, but the rumor went around that the empire could once again be without praetorians. And that was the end of it. In July, just 3 months after the fall of Maximian, in the heart of Rome, in broad daylight hours, the praetorians stormed the palace. They seized both emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus, in the middle of a quarrel. They were dragged through halls full of guards and killed on the spot. Without trial, no pomp. Their bodies were dragged through the streets. The crowd did not intervene. The Senate was silent. The empire was back in the hands of the Guard. But the people, shaken by the murder, demanded stability. And then the praetorians made a gesture that was unexpected. They proclaimed young Gordian III as emperor, the same boy who stood in the shadow of Pupienus and Balbin. He was only 13 years old. Thus ended another round of the horror of the 2038th year. 4 emperors dead, 2 deposed, 1 boy. Hope? Or a pause before a new nightmare? No one knew yet, but the entire empire froze. The unknown lay ahead. Gordian III, a name that had flashed up in the darkest moment of the 2038th year as a symbol of something new, almost pure. He was young, impeccably bred, from a family that had already paid in blood for trying to save the empire. His grandfather and uncle, Gordian I and II, had become martyrs of the Senate, and this young boy was a living reminder of that lost hope. He was only 13 years old when the praetorians proclaimed him emperor. The crowd in the streets of Rome welcomed the decision with relief. After months of murder, sieges, famine, rebellion, there was a ruler untainted by blood. He didn't command an army. He didn't order the execution of senators. He didn't argue with a colleague. He simply existed. And that was enough. The Senate, exhausted, depressed, accepted Gordian without objection. The empire was in ruins, but even ruins need a center. And that center was found in a boy with a soft voice and a serious look. Under him, regents ruled, first powerful senators, then military leaders. Actual power went to the court bureaucracy and the Guard. But the emperor's image remained more important. He was a symbol of unity. The army, too, embraced Gordianism. Praetorians, tired of the power of the old men and their intrigues, saw in him not a threat, but an opportunity to stabilize. The provinces, afraid of new taxes and invasions, preferred not to interfere, and for a short time, a fragile but tangible peace prevailed. But it was all an illusion. Gordian didn't rule. He was ruled. Under him, the power of the military was consolidated. The empire, already accustomed to the fact that the soldier is the main bearer of power, only strengthened this trend. The young emperor turned out to be not a reformer, but a transitional figure, a bridge between the old era and a new, much more terrible time, the crisis of the Third Age. A few years later, he would die under mysterious circumstances during a campaign against Persia. And with his death, the last glimmer of light from that tragic time will disappear. But in the year 238, he was needed. like a vow that everything could still be held together. He was the baby face of the empire, wounded, bloody, but unbroken. And though his reign began on the blood of 6 emperors, he was the embodiment of hope, fragile, but alive. Sometimes one face is enough to keep an empire standing a little longer. When the dust of the 2038th year settled, the Roman Empire was left standing, but not the same as it had been before. A year in which 6 emperors were replaced was not just a series of political disasters. It turned out to be a symptom of a profound disintegration, not just of power, but of the very idea of empire itself. Why did everything go wrong? First of all, the breakdown of institutions. The Senate was too weak to really govern, but too proud to give up power. It acted out of fear and out of principle, but without a plan. The praetorians, a guard meant to protect, became an instrument of assassination. The army dictated will but was fragmented, each legion its own policy. Power became a prey, not a service. Emperors were no longer inherited or chosen by the Senate. They were born in blood and disappeared in conspiracy. Second, there was an economic crisis. Provinces were being ravaged by taxes. Artisans were being impoverished. Gold was disappearing from circulation. To feed the army, the center squeezed the suburbs. Africa rose not out of patriotism, but out of desperation. The people no longer believed the capital cared about them. The empire began to crumble from within, not from the blows of enemies, but from fatigue and greed. The third thing was fear. Fear drove every decision. Maximian of Thrace ruled through intimidation and fell when fear turned against him. The senators feared the army. The army feared conspiracies. Ordinary citizens feared the emperors. It was impossible to make sound decisions in such an atmosphere. Anything built on fear would crumble at the first push. And there was another, often ignored, factor: an identity crisis. Who was a Roman now? Barbarians ruled the army. The provinces became more important than Italy. Greek was spoken more often than Latin. The empire was losing face. People no longer knew where the center was. Rome, Antioch, Carthage. It was not just a crisis of power. It was a crisis of meaning. The 2038th year was the moment when the empire looked into the abyss for the first time. And the abyss looked back. The 6 emperors is not an accident. It was an attempt to find a form that could hold together a disintegrating whole. No one had succeeded. Not the military, not the senators, not the sages, not the symbol boys. The very idea of power became a bargaining chip. Loyalty disappeared. Everyone acted out of profit or desperation. Rome became a place where power lasted not years, but days. Where death was not a risk, but part of the office. Where the fate of the emperor was determined not by citizens, not by laws, but by weapons and luck. And yet, the empire survived. Because it still had structure, habit, inertia. People believed in it as they believe in the sun, even when it is hidden behind clouds. But the crack remained, and every next crisis, from barbarian invasions to the east-west split, would begin here, in that dark vortex that opened in the year 238. Rome's worst year, not because many emperors died, but because it showed that the empire was no longer safe from itself.